Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Department of Classics and Religion at the University of Calgary. I'm Carolyn Music, Chair of Christian Thought. I'd like to welcome you all. It's really lovely to see everyone here. I'd like to say particularly welcome to our new cohort of graduate students. It's lovely to have you here. Welcome to Calgary. Before we start officially, I'd just like to say a few things. First, I would like ask everyone to please mute their audio during the duration of the lecture. The lecture today seminar will last around 45 to 50 minutes. And then we will have ample time for questions. And there'll be two ways that you can ask questions. You can do it the old-fashioned way by making yourself visible on Zoom and raising your hand, or you could use the reaction option on the bottom and raise your hand. Or you could type your question into the chat option and ask it in that way. So there's two forms that you could use. The other thing I'd like to say is that the lecture is being recorded, which is great, so we can come back and visit this. And now what I'd like to do before we officially start, I'd like to officially start the presentation and ask Monique, please, one of our helpers, technicians, assistants, to read the land acknowledgement. Monique?
Thank you, Carolyn. We would like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, the Piikani and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The city of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3.
Thank you so much. Now I'd really like to warmly introduce Reverend Dr. Carmen Landstown, who has graciously agreed to speak today and tomorrow, and someone who has such a busy schedule. It's such a pleasure to welcome you here and to have you be generous with your time. And I'd just like to say a few words about Reverend Dr. Landstown. Reverend Dr. Landstown is the Executive Director of First United Church Community Ministry Society and First United Church Social Housing Society. She joined First United in February 2017 and has led an organizational turnaround resulting in increased stability and capacity. Now that's a miracle in these days, I think, so well done. She currently sits on the boards of the Vancouver Foundation and the Sandy Saulteaux Spiritual Centre in Manitoba, and chairs the National Indigenous Candidacy Board for the United Church of Canada, supporting Indigenous and non-Indigenous candidates for ministry in Indigenous contexts. Reverend Dr. Landstown holds a PhD from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley, California, and is a member of the Heiltsuk First Nation. She writes and speaks on issues of Indigenous and intercultural theology, urban ministry, and systemic injustice. And I think this is very important to note. She is passionate about creating a life with great stories and amazing adventures with her family. And today, Reverend Dr. Landstown will be speaking on broken promises, broken systems, an Indigenous view of theodicy in the form of systemic injustice. Welcome, Reverend Dr. Landstown.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. I'm pleased to be joining you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, the Squamish, Nikum, and Hunkaminam-speaking peoples in and around the Burrard Inlet and what is now known as Greater Vancouver. And also thank you for the invitation to join you today and to give the Awassa Public Lecture on Urban Theology tomorrow jointly with the Calgary Public Library. As you said, my talk is entitled Broken Promises, Broken Systems, an Indigenous View of Theodicy in the Form of Systemic Injustice. I'm not sure that all of my thoughts got quite formed to fully support that title, but I am and have have been for years really fascinated by the concept of evil and theological issues around theodicy, and like, if God loves us and God wants the world to live and to live abundantly, then why does evil exist in the world? And so through the next, I don't know, it's probably going to be an hour. I aimed for 45 minutes, but I always get a little bit too verbose. I'd like to spend some time looking at the epistemological rationale for a specifically Indigenous view of theodicy, and specifically the broken promises and systems that have historically and continue to create injustice in the form of administrative or structural evil. In the last 3 weeks or so, I've really struggled with like a deep-seated discomfort with Monday's upcoming federal election. And for me, it's more than the fact that I'm dissatisfied with my current MP, who happens to be a cabinet minister, and I don't like the nominee from my party of preference. It's also a growing realization that despite a deep personal commitment to political engagement and a desire to participate in our democratic processes in Canada, these processes rarely, if ever, serve Indigenous people. And so perhaps this afternoon, politics is a good place to start. For the past several years, I've had a committed and loyal group of very politically engaged and active women in my life who have pressed me to run either for provincial or federal office. And after really struggling with this sense of external call about what might come next once I was finished with some of the big things that are on our horizon at First United, I had just barely come to a maybe position when this newsworthy moment in the summer of two incumbent MPs, both Indigenous women, spoke up and spoke out about why they would not be running in the next federal election. Nunavut MP Mamlat Kakak spoke passionately in mid-June about the fact that her service to Canada had left her feeling frustrated and alone. She spoke truth to power in naming that Canada was a country that is stained with blood, created off the backs of trauma and displacement of Indigenous people. And the fact that, you know, racism and white supremacy is still so prevalent that even as, you know, a person who should have, with her tenure, been known by security in the House of Commons, was quite frequently stopped and asked for ID, because what would a young Indigenous woman with face tattoos be possibly doing in the House of Commons? Next, independent MP for Vancouver Granville and former Liberal cabinet member and Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould followed within weeks with an open letter declaring her own decision that she would also not be seeking re-election, in part because in her view, Parliament had become more and more toxic and ineffective. In her announcement, Wilson-Raybould said, "This crisis is not really about the individual people in politics, many of whom are well-intentioned and do good works. Rather, it is in the way that we practice democracy in Canada and how we need to reconsider moving it forward, the lack of inclusiveness, and the lack of courage to speak the truth, and the failure of bystanders to support those who do." All of a sudden, I was faced with the fact that this was not a resounding endorsement of politics as a life-giving career choice for an Indigenous woman. But I also think that this dynamic sums up well my fascination with evil, and specifically the reason why theodicy is important as a contemporary subject of theological inquiry and discourse. Our systems of politics and governance are broken. Our capitalist system is broken. And while that's a matter of increasing disappointment and frustration for many, for those of us who live on the margins or the underside of society, there are real and tangible consequences that continue to prevent the flourishing of life and of human society, but indeed of all created order. So the baseline argument for me is that there is no option but for theodicy, or the fact that God permits evil, in a world where we hold the belief that the Creator has granted us free will. No, I don't necessarily subscribe to the soul-making arguments of those like John Hick and others who argue that God is justified in creating a world where evil exists for the purpose of humankind overcoming that evil in order to become closer to God. That seems to me to be a bit of a causal regression. And I also resist the libertarian free will approach, again, because it seems that those lines of inquiry in that tradition seem to also overcomplicate the matter. that free will is of great value, that free will must be defined as so free so that even God can't affect us to take any particular action, and that in any event, the possibility of free will is of such great value that it's more important than the outcome of the fact that sometimes people will make choices that result in evil actions or systems. It's more important to have free will than for God to create a world where we lack free will, even if that meant the erasure of evil. Richard Swinburne's further exploration of libertarian free will is that possible actions can be limited based on moral worth, and that the interactions between power to act to prevent evil may be called into question even further complicates that matter in ways that I don't even really fully comprehend. And then lastly, and more specifically from a Christian perspective, I find that most theological explanations of theodicy are wanting in that they're far too anthropocentric, ignoring the vast evils that humankind wreaks upon the rest of God's created order. I believe that part of the Euro-Christian or Euro-Western tradition of overcomplicating theologies of evil and theodicy stem in part from the epistemological hegemonies that privilege justified truth claims. So if you'll indulge me, I think it's important to frame the ways that Indigenous epistemologies become interesting tools for constructive theological enterprise, for both examinations of theology or theodicy and of theology more broadly. This is not because they don't employ the traditional, this is because they don't employ the traditional binary dualism and arguments of belief and justification of truth that preoccupies the discipline of Western epistemology since Descartes. In general, Indigenous epistemologies recognize multiple interpretations of truth and reality, maybe like a simpler form of Derridean semiotics of the event in a way, and we do so from a pragmatically pedagogical grounding. As I'll explain, the intent of our Indigenous positions or traditional worldviews is not ever phenomenological, but pedagogical. While there are multiple approaches to Western epistemology, so I'm not arguing that all Western epistemology is the same, so take Aristotle over Plato for a very simple example. Western philosophies of knowledge have been attempts to theorize what defines knowledge, and Indigenous epistemologies more broadly, in contrast, tend to be grounded in defining right action. I was taught by the late Sally McSaig, my first professor of theology, and have come to believe deeply that theology matters. What we do and think and say about God, the Spirit, and God incarnate matters. And our most profoundly held beliefs shape our thoughts and actions in ways that have real and tangible environmental and socio-political implications for the earth and for the communities in which we live. Theology as a discipline has both value proposition and ethical responsibility to it. It requires us to think deeply and critically about life, the cosmos, and the land. It can also be poetic language that marries our actions and our faith. I also side with George Tinker, who argues that all Indigenous theology is political theology, and specifically that, quote, any useful commentary by American Indians speaking to the Indian context today must reflect on the political state of Indian affairs and the political hopes and visions for recovering the health and well-being of Indigenous communities, end quote. This is not to draw necessarily on the formal Western tradition of political theology as begun by Metz and continued by Moltmann and Zula and others, but rather to say that the political laws, policies, and rights, legal rights, must be considered as part of any theology that speaks to the Indigenous context. Like Tinker, I consider myself to be grounded in the liberationist tradition. And a central commitment that I hold as a liberationist is that I do not believe that all narratives, all interpretations, all readings, and all contexts are equal. In fact, I believe this is the crux of what Gutierrez argues in A Theology of Liberation. Saying that God has a preferential option for the poor doesn't mean that God favors the poor, or oppressed, or Indigenous, over and above other people. Gutierrez explained once in an interview by saying, in some ways, option is perhaps the weakest word in that sentence. In English, the word merely connotes the choice between two things. In Spanish, however, it evokes a sense of commitment. The option for the poor is not optional, but is incumbent upon every Christian. liberationist thought calls on Christianity to commit to addressing the systems of injustice that cause oppression and the marginalization of entire communities. It doesn't call us to choose life only for the poor, as some fear when they ask, doesn't God love the rich? But rather that while systems of injustice exist, neither the oppressed or the oppressors are free. Because of this commitment, my work has always been grounded in the desire to open up theology by employing Indigenous epistemologies, by privileging Indigenous philosophy and theology alongside hegemonic Western thought patterns that either eradicate or subjugate Indigenous voices. During my doctoral studies, I explored the ways that Indigenous epistemologies become interesting tools for a constructive theological enterprise, in that they don't employ the traditional binary dualisms and arguments over belief and justification of truth that have preoccupied the discipline of Western epistemologies over centuries. While traditional Indigenous epistemologies use different and usually non-academic language, I continue to use the language of the academy, and this is an intentional choice on my part. But when I don't have time to explain it, it's not really all that necessary for today's purposes, just an acknowledgement that I see myself as a translator of surviving Indigenous intellectual brilliance into the language of the academy, because I think it has value for the world. In general, Indigenous epistemologies recognize multiple interpretations of truth and reality, and they do it from a pragmatically pedagogical grounding. While there are multiple approaches to Western epistemology, like I said before, it's really the focus of epistemology has been really to attempt to theorize what defines knowledge. As not to argue that there's been no progress or diversity of opinion, especially since the Enlightenment in Western philosophy, but in general, in Western definitions of knowledge is that phenomenology is centered and that it's based on formal logic. So in contrast, our Indigenous perspectives take what is known and extrapolate meaning from that truth, rather than theorizing what defines truth and then measuring experience against that definition. Hope that makes sense. So to make a generalization, if Western perspectives had tended to be more deductive, Indigenous perspectives would be more inductive. And you can probably already sense that that's my orientation by my critique of Euro-Christian theodicies in general. The privileging of Indigenous interpretations becomes pedagogically important because if we are to seek liberation within Canada and indeed the world, the narratives of the oppressed must be exposed, lifted up, and addressed, and the oppressors must be corrected if the oppressed and oppressors are to be liberated at all. So first, a quick note about why I use epistemology as a focus of study rather than cultural difference. Epistemology seems less accessible in some ways, and although the phrase cultural difference is often used to explain the gaps between Indigenous and settler societies, a dedicated study in epistemological difference is actually more focused in scope because culture can be used to express the interconnectedness of knowledge, language, belief, art, morals, and customs, where I'm really more primarily concerned with ways of knowing. And the purpose of comparing and contrasting Western and Indigenous epistemological perspectives could be controversial when examined by a Western mindset. So one of the things I had to work through with my doctoral committee, for example, was like, wasn't I just falling prey to the trap of relativism? And so I had to really think through, you know, lots of questions about that. And then I realized that question was defined in itself by this idea, going back to my previous example, of the fact that, you know, truth had been defined in a certain way, and then the performance of my thought was measured against that truth instead of trying to explain the difference in our worldviews. So if you uphold the primacy of the scientific method and philosophical reasoning that come out of the Enlightenment, you could argue that there's no difference in thought based on culture or history. Epistemology is simply epistemology. However, epistemology as a discipline is one that has, for millennia, been almost explicitly undertaken by Western thinkers, and with very little questioning of whether or not their perspectives were limited at all by being positioned as Western or being culturally Western. In particular, there's a heritage of European and particularly Anglo-Saxon thought that has been influential in the theological realm. And it's particularly problematic and further complicated by the nature of epistemological inquiry itself. If the root question of this philosophical discipline centers on what is justified true belief, then it would appear that this question would be the same regardless of cultural background, and therefore it would seem moot to offer alternative approaches to epistemology based on culture. Finally, the importance of the contrast rests in the fact that in the Western philosophical tradition, Indigenous ways of knowing have traditionally been excluded. My argument is that the question of what is justified true belief and its philosophical antecedents are useful insofar as they give us an important perspective that represents the normative nature of Western hegemony. However, I do not believe that the hegemonic Western views of what constitutes knowledge and belief are the only perspectives, and that perhaps the root questions of epistemological inquiry could be different if approached by different cultures. This may, rightly from a Western perspective, open my arguments to the charge of relativism, and there may be some merit to that charge, but philosophies from China, the Indian subcontinent, and Africa are also starting to separate themselves from the West. And my arguments, alongside those of my Indigenous sisters and brothers, add another perspective here. So I want to lay out some key assumptions upon which I see Indigenous philosophy or epistemology as being different than the Western tradition of philosophy and theology that we have all come to know and love in our studies. I need to recognize that in terms of Indigenous philosophy, there's no like textual corpus from which to draw. There's just a handful of contemporary American Indian, Alaskan Native, First Nations, and Métis scholars writing in the fields of philosophy, most often curricula studies, education, theology, who have built an even more scant tradition of Indigenous thought in North American academy. So you really have to find like articles or chapters that deal with the issue of epistemology. And so even though we have individuals writing that seek to represent these Indigenous ways of knowing, we're also still writing from uniquely individual perspectives, and we can't in any way compete with the wider body on epistemology that exists in the Euro-Western Academy. But Indigenous communities have had our own discrete epistemological perspectives and systems of thought for as long as Western philosophers have been contemplating questions of truth and knowledge, if not before. But until the late 20th century, they have not been discussed as such. In the introduction to his book, Sawak, An Indigenous Worldview, Uchano theorist Richard Atleo highlights this point in relation to Clement C.J. Webb's argument in A History of Philosophy that civilization begins with the leaving off telling tales. So Atleo goes on to note that his theory of Sawak not only begins with these tales or origin stories, but also depends on these tales as both the foundation of knowledge about the state of our existence and as a guide for its interpretation. And this is the difference in the simple contrast that I wish to highlight. In other words, truth and fiction cannot be so easily divided. There have only been a handful of Indigenous scholars to complete doctoral studies in philosophy, although that number is slowly increasing. And as such, any examination of our work is by no means comprehensive. But there are some real points of brilliance that I want to highlight, in addition to the fact that civilization, or this myth that civilization began with moving from the telling of fiction or myth to chronological worldview based on history and the ability to document things in writing. So Brian Yazzie Burkhart uses the archetype of coyote as a philosopher in Native American legends, who often loses the sense of himself and his place in the world because he's too busy wondering about things and how they really work. Plato told the story of the Greek thinker Thales, who was ridiculed for being so eager to know what was happening in the heavens that he fell down a well, unaware of what had been at his feet. The difference in the two approaches, Burkhart says, is that Plato uses the story of Thales to make clear what philosophy is, He explains that the philosopher is unaware what his next door neighbor is doing, hardly knows indeed whether the creature is a man at all. He spends all his pains on the question what man is, and what powers and properties distinguish such a nature from any other. The stories of Coyote, conversely, are meant to show Coyote's mistakes. Like Thales, Coyote has forgotten the simple things. He has forgotten his relation. He has forgotten what is behind him and what is at his feet. When Coyote behaves this way, he always finds trouble. He's mocked in these stories because he is behaving in the wrong way, and so the stories are meant to show us how not to act. They show us what philosophy is not, and not, as in the case of Plato and Thales, what is and what it ought to be. In Indigenous epistemologies, according to this difference outlined here, there's less concern for metaphysical principles and more concerns with simple everyday things around us. Burkhardt also argues there's an importance in the way in which questions are framed. Unlike Western epistemologies that presume unquestionable truths guide our lines of inquiry, in other words, we can ask any question we desire and in any way we desire, and the answer will remain the same. Indigenous epistemologies hold that how we act is not merely a response to stimuli, rather the way in which we ask questions, the way in which we act towards our relations, guides us to the right answers rather than the other way around. Therefore, in Indigenous epistemology, the thinker is guided by the limits of questioning rather than the limits of reason. This is something I know to be true in my learning from my own elders. I was told as a young adult that you could not learn with idle hands. Rather than sitting down to interview elders, it was more appropriate to be busy with them. Then you could talk. I learned some of my most important lessons about our culture and about our people's traditions while sewing, washing dishes, walking through the woods to gather traditional medicines. It's only when your hands are busy that you learn. This is further nuanced in the way in which our statements about the state of things can imply a desired outcome or action. There are few situations in traditional Indigenous cultures where it would be necessary to ask a question. This idea supports my experience of why we had to be busy to learn. Asking questions was inappropriate. Spending time working with somebody is an invitation to let them teach you something about life. Viola Cordova, who was the first Native American woman to earn a PhD in philosophy, recounts the experience of raising her children and announcing, "Your room is messy," or "The garbage can is full," as a way to initiate the desired outcome, i.e. the room being cleaned or the garbage being taken out. And she explained, "My value system is based around the concept of a human being that says that all humans are equal and therefore deserving of respect. Who am I to command another to do my bidding? Just as one cannot tell another person what to do, one also cannot ask for anything. To ask for something is simply to imply an inability to be independent. To ask for anything is to imply the person asks that he or she has failed to be perceptive to the other's existence or needs. Telling another human being what to do implies a position of command that no human being or no real human being would presume to take upon himself or herself." So meaning is not shaped by inquiry into the human mind, but rather by participation in right action. In the tradition of theology, we might say epistemology begins in theological anthropology. The subtlety of human-to-human relationships is therefore much more focused on the other and the needs and inherent rights and being of the other, and less so with the intentional inquiry presented by Western philosophical traditions. Burkhardt argues that the limits of questioning are also related to a fourth principle, which is the moral universe. He writes, "The idea is simply that the universe is moral. Facts, truth, meaning, and even our existence are normative. In this way, there's no difference between what is true and what is right. The guiding question for the entire philosophical enterprise is, what is the right road for humans to walk?" This is perhaps one of the greatest points of contention in my experience between Western and Indigenous worldviews. Right action becomes a priority over justified truth as the teleological goal of rational inquiry. So from the outset, the difference in limiting questions over reasoning is a chasm that must be bridged between our cultures before philosophical dialogue can happen. That cultural difference, as articulated by Burckhardt, Cordova, and others, underscores the limits of Western questioning and the search for reason as experienced by Indigenous communities. Oftentimes, we've found that without investing in intimate relationship where right action becomes discernible because there's a relationship between two people, there's a limit to true understanding. You think about that in terms of this like necessary and informed consent, right? There's no relationship between the state and traditional communities, or if there is, it's a very like, well, we've defined it this way, and so we've done it according to how we've defined it, as opposed to we've developed a relationship with these people, and that relationship is intimate enough that we can know each other and that we can really understand and discern what is the next right action. Based on that example, these differences are not merely academic. They've guided failed interactions between Indigenous people and settlers in North America throughout the last 500 years. And the dominance of Western approaches also continues to frame the way in which Indigenous people are objectified in study based on scientific empiricism, and that are disconnected from the moral relationality and limits on questioning that shape our traditional worldviews. I'm going to skip this next little bit because I've sort of made my point, but the last epistemological difference between Indigenous and Western perspectives is the concept of a linear progression of time. And one of the best explanations of Indigenous concepts of history and time, in my view, are presented by Donald Fixico in The American Indian Mind in a Linear World. Aside from the fact that Indigenous oral traditions do not satisfy Western philosophical requirements of truth and justification, they're also uniquely epistemologically different in that their function is not about chronology and documentation, but it's pedagogical and ethical. Native oral traditions are ways of explicating the moral universe. The principal constituent of Indigenous epistemology, as outlined by Burckhardt above. The Indigenous oral traditions are pedagogical in that they teach our communities central truths or values which are formative in right relationships for all creation. Indigenous oral traditions are also political in that they embody the consensus-based decision-making model which Fixico articulates in his understanding of our Indigenous thinking. He describes Indian thinking as, quote, visual and circular in philosophy. Embedded in an Indian traditional reality, this ethos is a combination of the physical reality and the metaphysical reality. Listening and observing the natural environment is essential to the Indian mindset. Decision-making is responsive in nature due to considering all of the physical and metaphysical factors affecting one's life. Coming to a consensus is coming to a balance of all those factors so that the right decision is the best decision for all concerned, end quote. He goes on to say that the power of story through the oral tradition is also explained in how all of this transcends time, thus making time less relevant to the power of oral narrative told effectively. In addition, many Indigenous cultures have strict ownership and protocols around the use of stories and preserving the tradition rather than accuracy in a way that honors its origins and purpose. Fixico argues that an Indigenous perspective values the principles of right action and meaning making. So the purpose of telling a story or a history is not to present knowledge a priori or the justification of an a priori knowledge, but rather to define the right way of being in balance with the world and to synthesize a communal experience of what right path of action should be. Fixico's idea is supported by the arguments of another important Native philosopher who I've already mentioned, Viola Cordova. She articulates a resulting difference between Indigenous and Western worldviews is determining how to define or understand stability. For Western thinkers, stability as seen as static and unchanging. Stability denotes for Native Americans a balancing act, she says, in a universe exhibiting many motions that will require different balances. And the last thing I want to highlight is the difference in the foundation of Western thought on binary dualism. While the most prominent dualism in Western critiques, especially from feminist philosophers, is the mind-body dualism, Burckhardt argues for a higher prioritization of the individual-collective dualism. He writes, the real Cartesian bias is the idea that knowledge can only be acquired and manifested individually, in or by the individual. The cogito ergo sum tells us, I think, therefore I am. But native philosophy tells us, we are, therefore I am. A native philosophical understanding must include all experience, not simply my own. If I am to gain a right understanding, I must account for all that I see, but also all that you see and all that has been seen by others, all that has been passed down in stories. What place do I have to tell you that your experiences are invalid because I do not share them? And this points to a large difference in terms of binary dualisms between Western and Indigenous thought. The area of Western binary dualisms has been largely imposed on Indigenous communities in North America, which are viewed as primitive and not developed or civilized, diminishing their traditional worldviews in profound ways. Philosopher Ann Waters argues, quote, the maintenance of the rigid, distinct boundaries of the binary logic enable, though may not necessitate, a hierarchical value judgment to take place, mind over body, male over female, precisely because of the sharp bifurcation. A non-binary or complementary dualism would place the two constructs together in such a way that one could remain itself and also be part of the other. In this way, a hierarchical valuing of one being better, superior, or more valued than another cannot be, or rather is excluded by non-binary logic. And this, for me, is the philosophical issue at stake. Western binary thinking insists that Indigenous epistemologies are a radical departure from Western epistemology. And from a Western perspective, this may be so, but from an Indigenous perspective, they can be complementary, adding up to the whole of human philosophical experience. While Waters would acknowledge that the domination of Indigenous peoples in North America by successive generations of settlers has resulted in large gaps in the original ontologies and epistemologies of our Indigenous cultures, she argues, and I agree, that kernels of knowledge have remained. Just because many Indigenous peoples have been actively eliminated or prevented from practice doesn't mean we don't understand them to be true or have an intuitive critique of the culture imposed on us as the dominant alternative. She writes, the importance of order and balance, as well as a proper or moral behavior, are part of the cosmological understanding of our universe. This perspective has often been dismissed because it's often presented in romanticized ways by Indigenous and non-Indigenous scholars outside of the field of philosophy. However, the work of the growing number of Indigenous philosophers in the Academy brings to light the ways in which this intuitive epistemological foil can show the Academy a different way of doing philosophy in a moral universe. The non-discrete, non-binary thought bases of Indigenous cultures is important regarding another aspect of cultural misunderstanding that happens between Native and non-Native scholars, namely the question of the essence of indigeneity. So, for example, because of my white-looking skin, and because we are not 100% blood quantum or some other acceptable percentage in US political discourse or the right kind of status, meaning the legal status passed down by the father as defined in Canadian law, we, meaning my mother, my brother, my children, and me, are somehow considered by non-Heiltsuk people less Heiltsuk than someone whose percentage ranks higher or whose skin is darker. Yet I have been told by my elders that regardless of who my father is and regardless of who my son's father is, we are Heiltsuk. Waters' reasoning for non-discrete, non-binary dualisms in Indigenous thought is based on transcultural studies of surviving Native languages in North America. In outlining the move towards articulating her own Indigenous ontology and epistemology, she writes, I then thought about static bifurcations of the discrete binary bounded dualities of essentialisms in contemporary feminist thought and recent race theory. The male-female, masculine-feminine, man-woman, black-white, Indian, non-Indian, Hispanic, not Hispanic, Asian, non-Asian, etc. These discretely bifurcated and essentialized concepts suggested a way of being in the world that might run contrary to some Indigenous ontology that we find remaining in American Indian languages. And the problem seemed to be not so much that language has gone on a holiday, but rather that deep structures of Indigenous thinking about our relations in the world conflicted with those discrete binary logics that are inherent in Euro-American reflection about those relationships in the world. She cites the cry of Caribbean women in race theory who are asking, why can't I be Black and Hispanic? By Paula Gunn Allen, an Indigenous literary critic who asks, who are these people who want to control through language use who I am? I share this experience in my relation to my late white adopted grandmother, who objected ever so politely to me as identifying as solely Heiltsuk. At the very least, she would have preferred that I self-identify as bicultural. It sounds so much more benign, doesn't it? But my people have told me I am Heiltsuk, and we are, therefore I am. I'm going to skip some of the other stuff that I want because I want us to be able to have some discussion, but I think one of the biggest focuses of the sort of broken systems, broken promises idea is this cross-cultural miscommunication, but also the real impacts of that in terms of land. And so I've got my decolonized t-shirt on today. Yesterday I was wearing my land back hoodie. But I think that when we're working or the function of this difference and the fact that these binary dualisms and justified truth claims have become the normative hegemonic force in the way that we view the world from a Euro-Western or Euro-Christian perspective, it ends up, for me and for many Indigenous scholars, always going back to a question of land. But then that idea quickly gets subsumed in this hegemonic drive to eradicate difference. In itself, like aside from the doctrine of discovery and the theological bases of likening the discovery of North America to the discovery of the Promised Land and all of the theological justification for that. I think there's also these other cultural pieces for a Christian theological impulse in the way that we read, for example, Galatians 3. So like there's neither nor that we're trying to eliminate all of these differences, because that way if we're all the same and we live in a particular Western democratic free system, then our differences don't need to be taken into account in terms of our moral or ethical choices. And I think left unchecked, that hegemonic drive will continue to ensure that Indigenous epistemologies remain disproven, discounted, fictional, anecdotal, or inappropriately subjective in an academy that's dominated by an unchallenged epistemology that's based on this Cartesian way of thinking. There's a Sami educator named, I can never say her, Rauna Kuokkanen, who studied at UBC. And in trying to answer Gayatri Spivak's question of can we know each other and this notion of Eurocentric arrogance and conscience, she says that the simplistic assumption that as long as one has sufficient information, one can understand the other. And I think for me, that's at the crux of like some of the cultural conflict that's happening right now around murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, the prevalence of Indigenous poverty in this country, the over-incarceration of Indigenous and other Black and brown bodies, is that as long as we throw information and statistics at each other, that somehow we're going to understand each other. And we're attacking these problems as problems, but not really truly understanding the needs or centering the experience and lived embodied experience of the people who are the most oppressed in this context. So Kuokkanen says that based on these epistemological differences that I've highlighted, and the ways, in fact, that they're all often counterintuitive to each other, We can see why Spivak labels this Eurocentric perspective as an arrogance of conscience. But the question of can we know each other is important because the future of our relationships depends on it. And Indigenous epistemologies offer a gift in terms of how we approach knowing each other. We can avoid these discrete binary dualisms of us and other. As Cordova reminds us, we must, as philosophers, not lose sight of the fact that the reason for exploring alien ideas is to expand our understanding of the diversity of human thought, and not to expand our own specific ways of thinking so that they encompass all others. The purpose of examining, for me, Indigenous and Western epistemologies alongside each other is to strive for this non-binary and complementary way of knowing. Assuming that the purpose of creating a non-binary complementary dualism is in itself consistent with Indigenous epistemologies, that it's both pedagogical and ethical in purpose, we can ask the question, to what end? Given the complete success of colonization's transformation of indigenous communities and cultures to creating cycles of paternalism and dependency, the identification of these social dynamics is imperative as a precursor to the much desired healing and reconciliation sought by North Americans in the current context. And so I wanted to close by going back to the question of evil, and for me, it was a little bit self-indulgent to go back to my doctoral work and think about these differences, but you know, there's a really deep importance to it, I think, because unless we understand the different ways in which we see the world, and I think the gift that Indigenous ways of being and knowing can sort of broaden this idea of dialogue and relationships and being competitive to being complementary. I think going back and spending some time looking at those differences is really important because evil does exist in the world, and for me, it exists in the form of broken promises and broken systems. And I think that if we were to work alongside each other to build right relationships, to focus on pedagogy, on ethics, on right action, then we would have a better basis for tackling some of these big socio-political and economic questions together. So I just want to define evil a little bit, though. I side with the late psychiatrist Scott Peck in that I believe that, quote, we brush up against evil, not once or twice in a lifetime, but almost as routinely as we come into contact with human crises, end quote. In his examination of group evil, Peck credits modern specialization in post-industrial life to the ways in which groups of people can cause the perpetuation of evil acts, even as that evil was never intended. Describing groups of individuals as less than the sum of their parts, with the resulting dynamic being that the causes of groups committing acts of evil is overdetermined. So kind of going back to Jody Wilson-Raybould, there's so many good people in politics and in the civil service who have good intentions and are doing good things, and yet our political systems and our governance is becoming more and more toxic and more oppressive. Citing his ability to write as a psychiatrist, as a specialist in his field of study, he is dependent on farmers, mechanics, publishers, and booksellers, rendering it hard to claim specialization as inherently evil. He goes on, however, to say, on the other hand, I am thoroughly convinced that much of the evil of our times is related to specialization, and that we desperately need to develop an attitude of suspicious caution towards it. Scott Peck's exploration of group evil gets at the heart of the way in which our administrative systems, and for me, that would be the Crown and Indigenous Relations Ministry, Department of Indian Affairs, the worst consequences of those systems can and do result in evil. Touching briefly on the possibility of groups to pass the buck, something that hasn't come up at all in the run-up to Monday's election. He argues, in a way, it not only does the individual forsake their conscience, but the conscience of the group as a whole can become so fragmented and diluted as to be non-existent. The fact of the matter is that any group will remain potentially conscienceless and evil until such time as each and every individual holds himself or herself directly responsible for the behavior of the whole group, the organism of which they are a part. And I think, you know, again, going back to Jodie Wilson-Raybould, I think that that is the frustration that she felt working in the government, and as somebody with, you know, diminished over time, but and originally, like, you know, fairly significant structural and social power as in her role as Attorney General, but saw it devolve over time to where, like, there's a lack of individual agency or commitment to the ethical considerations of how we interact with each other. Because this type of effect of specialization on groups to result in a fragmented or diluted group conscience is easiest to see when it goes terribly wrong, as in the case of the My Lai crimes of the US Armed Forces during the Vietnam War, which he explores in his book People of the Lies, or the much studied effects of specialization and the demand for efficiency that numbed some of the members of the Third Reich from seeing the truly horrific big picture of the final solution during the Second World War. Ethicists Guy Adams and Danny Balfour explore the existence of this kind of abdication from personal responsibility in affecting evil in the world in their book, Unmasking Administrative Evil. Adams and Balfour, like Peck, see the post-industrial focus on technology and the scientific analytic mindset, what they call technical rationality, a big sibling to specialization perhaps, as enabling a new bewildering form of evil that they call administrative evil. And they write, quote, "Administrative evil may be masked in many different ways, but the common characteristic is that people can engage in acts of evil unaware that they are in fact doing anything at all wrong. Indeed, ordinary people may simply act appropriately in their organizational role. In essence, just doing what those around them agree that they should be doing, and at the same time, participate in what a critical and reasonable observer, usually well after the fact, would call evil. Even worse, under conditions of what we call moral inversion, in which something evil has been redefined convincingly as good, think residential schools, for example, ordinary people can all too easily engage in acts of administrative evil while believing that what they are doing is not only correct, but in fact good." The fact that Adams and Balfour have named technical rationality as a problem is particularly instructive. While postmodern philosophers, theologians, and even scientists have started to deconstruct the challenges of the scientific mindset, influenced by Descartes and articulated by Hume and others, there is a distinct characteristic of technical rationality that lends itself to the possibility of failing to prevent or predict acts of evil. And this, to me, I think, is a really interesting problem in the 21st century when we're looking at the way that algorithms guide our lives. You know, for example, when Netflix first came out, their algorithms were like, okay, you like this video, you like this funny cat video, so I will now suggest for you all of the funny cat videos. And then, as part of its function in the capitalist machine and developing more ad revenues and things, they developed predictive analytics. So you like this funny cat video, maybe you like this funny dog video. Oh, you like to watch like videos of animals having mishaps, maybe you want to watch this video about like cruelty to animals. And so you can sort of fall down a rabbit hole of these like logical progressions that test based on what you're liking and not liking on social media. And it's resulting in the possibility for like really radical departures from where people originally entered this this part of how they're interacting with the matrix of the internet. And so we're seeing that because of the effects of artificial intelligence and this predictive analytics, that political radicalization and religious radicalization is very much on the rise from the lack of human control over the way that algorithms are affecting our choices on the internet. which I also see as having like real tangible consequences when you look at, you know, the things that people are seeing on the internet about vaccines and COVID, or Black Lives Matter, or Blue Lives Matter, or you know, the presence of Russian bots in affecting, you know, affecting American elections or Canadian elections. And it's a really important thing for us to pay attention to, I think. So they argue that administrative evil is different in part because of the culture of technical rationality tends to drive the consideration of ethics out of the picture altogether. Nobody ever thought to question the ethics of algorithms. Not to mention the rational calculation of how much good can legitimately be traded off against evil. Because administrative evil is masked, ethics are not considered in this situation at all, meaning that we do not even see a choice about what we might, about which we might calculate degrees of good. In many ways, evil seems to be a harsh label for the institutionalized racism and systems of colonial dominance that continue to guide almost all Indigenous settler relations in Canada, and for the socio-political systems which allow it to continue to ravage communities in our traditional territories in the name of progress. But it should be no surprise to us after the 1996 final report of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, which had over 400 recommendations, the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which had 95 calls to action, the final report of the National Inquiry on Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls that had 123 recommendations, that the relationship between Indigenous people and the rest of Canada is still largely based in systemic violence, based on decades of the intersections of oppression on multiple levels, primarily class and race. And those oppressions are perpetrated by economic systems and these systems of administrative evil, which value capital and its growth over the lives and existence of human individuals, communities, and the broader ecosystems of which we are a part. Administrative evil needs to be named by theologians and ethicists as such, especially in the ways that it converts under the moral inversion named by Adams and Balfour to policies that are argued to be not only rational but good. As the colloquial saying goes, you cannot heal or change what you do not acknowledge, and the definitive examples of administrative evil that resulted in the Holocaust, other war crimes, such as those in My Lai, or the Indian residential schools in Canada or boarding schools in the US must teach us not to stay silent in the face of this shadow side of technical rationality. The relationships between Indigenous nations in the state are easily seen to be primarily governance and political problems. But there can be a theological response, as argued by the mid-century political theologian Johann Metz. A theological response which means that, quote, the social conflicts in the world move to the center of ecclesial and theological awareness. Conditions that are directly contradictory to the gospel, like oppression, exploitation, and racism, become challenges for theology. They demand the formulation of the faith in categories of transformation and of a resistance that is prepared to suffer. Consequently, theology from its own logos becomes political. End quote. The history of our relationship is peppered with broken promises in the form of original and contemporary treaties broken, as well as failures of the government and corporations to abide landmark legal decisions that recognize the rights of Indigenous people as being exceptional and inherent in the Canadian context. The relationship is also dominated by broken systems that are not serving Indigenous peoples, from health systems that provide substandard care and that fail to address the overt and covert racism in their system, in our hospitals and medical care, to the continued complete incompetence to address the challenge of the lack of access to clean drinking water in Indigenous communities across the country, to the fact that there are currently more Indigenous children in foster care than this right now today than the total number of students who attended Indian residential schools over the course of the century. The police and social welfare systems have yet to take meaningful action to protect the bodies of Indigenous women and girls, or to prevent the significant over-incarceration of Indigenous bodies and other people of color. Never mind the rampant ecocide, or the fact that we're barreling headlong into a climate emergency. For me, so much of these broken promises and systems result from the increasing technicality and specialization and our human systems recreate that absolve our individual actions while they contribute to systems of oppression. It used to be, I thought, that human flourishing depended on a reclamation of the common good, so this idea that we are guided by right action informed by the experience of all, and not just by measuring our actions against a culturally defined idea of what is right, as well as a marked revolution of capitalist structures. Quickly, a little shout out, if you haven't read Mission Economy, just out this year by Mariana Mazzucato, an Italian economist who teaches in London, she argues for exactly that. It's the first book to make me hopeful about human existence in a long time. Now, I think it's our very human existence, not just flourishing, but our existence that depends on a revolution in our thought, but a revolution in thought that results in a drastically different action and drastically different commitments to each other. Despite the fact that our Indigenous cultures are markedly diminished due to the cultural genocide of colonization, I do, alongside Waters, believe that there is enough lived or embodied remembrance that if we centered Indigenous ways of knowing in the world, if we focus on pedagogy, ethics, community, and right action, that there is a possibility we could find a way to confront the systems of oppression that continue to hold down Indigenous people and other marginalized peoples as subaltern communities oppressed by the machines of colonization and capitalism that in truth diminish us all. So I want to close with an example from our culture here on the coast. You know, the anti-potlatch laws were a very famous way of, I guess, controlling or eradicating Indigenous culture on the coast here in British Columbia. And it's all tied up in our traditional economic system where power and prestige was not based on how much wealth you could amass, but how much you could give away. So I think that part of our culture is very beautiful. There's a particular dance called the Heiltsuk, which is part of the sacred red cedar bark ceremony at the opening of the potlatch. And the purpose of the dance is to outline the human experience. The Kwakwaka'wakw cultures recognize that there exists good and evil in the world, and it's possible for one human being to be so consumed by an insatiable hunger for more. In the case of the Heiltsuk, he wants more food so far as to want food in the form of human flesh. And so he cries and he shouts and he screams throughout the first 3 songs in the Heiltsuk dance cycle. And he becomes possessed by the Heiltsuk. The Heiltsuk becomes possessed by the spirit of Bakbakwanunutsiwe, which is a representation for the potential of any human to go too far into the extreme of greed and wanting more. And it kind of ties into our systems of economics, which is based on a worldview of abundance. You only need to take as much as you need because you trust that there will always be more, as opposed to like the Western, scarce competition for scarce resources. The world's perceived to be overly abundant in all things needed to sustain life, and taking more than was needed to provide for people was seen as unnecessary. There was no need to take extra to make profit because the environment always provided more of what you needed. And so this idea of being consumed by Bakbakwanunutsiwe was so foreign to our cultures because there was never any need to take more. And I also liken it to the idea of the manna and the quail, right? That it spoils because you just have to trust that God will provide more. So the taming of the Heiltsuk is enacted by the community. So going back to this idea that it's the common good, it's the understanding of the needs of all that actually guide us to right action. And so through the singing of songs, dancing for the Heiltsuk, and using the magical cedar bark medicine to expel the spirit of Bakbakwanunutsiwe from him, it's therefore the function of the community to ensure that its members do not lose sight of our interdependence, which informs our economic worldview. There's some members of Kwakwaka'wakw culture who believe that although there's been this concept of Bakbakwanunutsiwe since time immemorial, that the Heiltsuk dance was actually created post-contact with Western culture. In this light, it could be seen as a reaction to the blatant greed and overconsumption of Western capitalist forms of economics. And so, that's just one area where I think that if we could sit down and share with each other and look at all of the ways that our collective actions are hurting each other, that Indigenous worldviews and our traditional stories, while they're ethical and pedagogical, could actually lead us into new ways of being in right relationship with each other. So I definitely went the hour instead of 45 minutes. I'm glad I put that little caveat that could happen. And because I've just told the story of the dance of the Hamatsa, I want to end with a prayer that I wrote during my MDiv that is my prayer for our human relationships, and it's based on the story of the Hamatsa. So let us pray. Ha-mai, we go around the world, truly, the superpowers, looking for food around the world. Ha-mai, truly, we are the superpowers at both sides of the world. We always want to eat much, truly. The spirit of Bakbak-Walanuksiwe overcomes us. Ha-mai. We, the superpowers, trying to eat alone. Truly, the food which we did not obtain. We, the superpowers at the far edge of the world. Yea. Begin, we, the superpowers, to feel the feathers all around us. Yea. Begin, we, the cannibals, no longer feel weak with temptation. We, the oversatiated all around the world, superpowers, yea. Feel the feathers of peace all around us. Ha-mai. God, press down our cannibal madness, yea. God, press down our whistles, our cannibal cries. God, press down our hunger for more, yea. Indeed, our faces are always looking for food, for more, for the skulls of the innocent. Our faces looking, devouring property everywhere. We superpowers, yea. This winter ceremonial song for me, for us. Hamatsa, this song for me, O you superpowers, Glukwala. God destroys our cannibal spirit, the spirit of Bakbak-Walanuksiwe, runs and hides everywhere. God's power makes the temptation hide. Glukwala kaswai, ha-mai. We are supernatural Christians, Glukwala, going all around the world, ha-mai, walking all around the world, yea. Prophesying against evil from the bad side, prophesying God from the good side, Glukwala. Us, the supernatural powers, truly are joining in God's dance. Glukwala kaswai, ha-mai, ha-mai. Because God carries a rattle in her hands. We join in God's praise. Because God carries all in his hands. We join in God's praise. Yea. Amen. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reverend Dr. Lansdowne, for that very enriching talk that led us through a lot of different perspectives and raises, I think, very pressing questions as we face elections across the country and in Alberta itself, in the province next month. And I am sure that there are many questions that will arise now in response to your talk. Just to remind the audience that there's two forms. If you'd like to ask a question, you can turn on your video and raise your hand, and I will call on you, or you could type into the chat as well to ask a question. While people are collecting their thoughts, I wanted to ask this term administrative evil. I think many of us can respond to that, react to that. And defining that, I think, is extremely important. And in your perspective, how does that get named? Who does the naming in administrative evil?
Try to make yours out. I mean, I think it has to be like both the acted upon and the actors. So for example, I work in Vancouver, in the downtown east side, in Canada's poorest urban postal code, and homelessness is a huge problem here. I was reading some, BC Housing has this world-renowned research center on housing policy, and I was reading I was going through their library of some of their recent research, and there was a study done on tiny homes. I thought, oh, amazing, because there's actually like a block from my office, there's this big graffiti on a building that says, City of Vancouver, please just give us tiny homes. And so I was like, perfect, I want to see what BC Housing is saying about this. And this whole paper, like this body that has responsibility for the homeless population in the province, this whole paper where you've got like a community of people experiencing homelessness, which is like, just give me a tiny home, like, you know, set up shop somewhere where I can have somewhere place dry and safe to sleep. I thought for sure this paper on tiny homes was going to touch on tiny homes as a potential solution for homelessness, if not a permanent solution, at least a temporary solution. The whole paper was about the role that tiny homes could play for the missing middle and having somewhere cheap and somewhat adequate to stay while they saved up for a down payment on a house in an unaffordable real estate market. That's it. That's the only way in which tiny homes were considered. And I was like, you have this whole population of people that are like, hello, over here, we are interested in this as an option. And it's just like, it's not defined as part of their research question. So like, let's not consider that for you know, it's only as a tool for generating single family home ownership. And, you know I kind of like really breezed through like a decade of research on this, like differences in epistemology, and it makes sense when I read it. And then sometimes even when I'm saying it out loud, I'm like, this is probably really too dense for a lecture. So I apologize for that. You know, this idea of having to wait to take in the perspectives of all before I'm making a decision. You know, like how often do we really do that? We don't do that because it takes too much time. And it creates the possibility for conflict that's really inconvenient. And so I think, like, you know, there are always the people on the underside of any system or conversation that are already speaking truth to power. But so it's not to say like they should be the ones to speak up, because it also has to be, to Jody Wilson-Raybould's point, like they need more allies in positions of power to say like, hey, we need to actually stop and take into account what is needed in this situation. Like, what are the needs of all who are impacted? And have we really thought about who is the all that is impacted by a particular decision or policy? You know, I kind of laugh. In British Columbia, we've you have this new DRIPA, like the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People Act. And we're out of compliance with it all over the place, right? Like, because I think that the government was like, oh, UNDRIP's a really good idea. And so, of course, because we're people who say that we believe in reconciliation, we should make UNDRIP we should make a law that says that we have to be in compliance with UNDRIP. And then when push comes to shove and it comes to these individual policy decisions across all the different departments of government, they're like, well, that's not pragmatic, and we can't center the needs and rights of Indigenous people, because what about everybody else? And that's so much more complicated than just going for the status quo and like the lowest common denominator of what happens. And so, you know, I think that that's like the worst and most egregious example I can think of like performative allyship on the part of the government. Like, I just sit there and I go, like, were you really so completely unaware of what UNDRIP was, which is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and the implications for how you would have to change, that you actually made it into a law that you can't actually comply with the terms of the law you just enacted. So you're going to be out of compliance almost immediately.
Just Carmen, I think there's some follow-up questions to that have come up. And first, we have 3 questions lined up. First is Nestor, and then Reese. And I'm happy to say we have a question from one of our graduate students, Kelly, that Monique will read out after Nestor and Reese's questions.
Carmen, thank you so much for your paper. Always a pleasure to listen to you. When I started working with liberation theology, one of the things that kept popping up was the whole notion of structural sin, and eventually came out and turned into structural evil or systemic evil. And so what I hope is that you can comment on the more, when we connect the whole ideas of critical theory and even ideas of decolonization, it almost seems as if we need to go beyond just identifying a structural sin and a structural evil to the very logic that actually makes this possible. I think at one point it was really easy or easier to blame someone, to say these are the people responsible. And now we are becoming a lot more aware that things are a whole lot more complicated, and that many of us or all of us are in some way implicated. So I was just hoping that you could speak to that complexity of identifying evil somewhere out there, and how how implicated all of us are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I think for me, that's sort of what I spent this pandemic thinking about. It's like, because one, you see the disruption, like one disruption in like the production of a chip for like, manufacturing trucks has created this huge supply chain disruption that, and you see those kinds of like disruptions over and over again throughout the pandemic, where it's just laid bare how interconnected and interdependent the whole world is, and in the ways where it's impacted our lives, but also in the ways where we haven't really thought about it, right? Like I was sharing with Carolyn and somebody from the library yesterday, one of the best and most terrifying articles I read early in the pandemic was like, please keep your videos off during Zoom chats, because the greenhouse gas emissions from 1 hour of video calls equates to about 5 kilometers of driving a car. From the data storage costs and just the cost of powering the big data centers that enables all of this really great technology that's kept us all connected and from losing our minds over the last 18 months. Yesterday, I saw an article around the dark data carbon costs of like the 25,000 pictures that are stored on my iPhone that I just think, they go off into the cloud somewhere, and I don't think about that. And I think that for me, and Nestor, you know me, like my name in Kwakwala is Kwisalach, which means woman who travels to many places far away. And that's like, I was given that name after people knew who I was. Like from serving on the World Council of Churches and participating in different global Indigenous theological consultations with them, but also just, my grandparents, my adopted white grandparents, having bred into me at a very young age a deep love of travel, which I've now passed on to my children. And it was like, I had this very visceral reaction to like, I'm grounded. Like I'm literally grounded. On Wednesday, when I fly to Winnipeg for a Sandy Saulteaux board meeting, like that will be my first time being on a plane in, 20 months, and which is the longest I think I have not been on a plane since I was 5. And it's really forced me, we've done these little staycations and we've gone camping, and I'm like, my life would be okay if I just was where I'm at in British Columbia. There's so much beauty to explore, and it's where I'm from, and it's where I feel connected to the land, and more so, I think, than some of my Indigenous sisters and brothers that feel really committed to being in their home territories and working in their home territories and their communities. I really felt this challenge to my, I think, inherited sense of privilege. Of course, the whole world is mine. And, I even remember making a glib argument to somebody once, well, if we're going to have a carbon budget, then scientists and environmental activists and theologians should be we should get to fly first. forget the executives from Monsanto. But like in reality, that's not going to happen. And I can't say that just because Monsanto's had a bigger collective impact on the world than the United Church of Canada, that my flying should be a bigger priority, right? So I think it's time for us, like, I mean, we're out of time to start to point fingers and to say, like, this, you know, this is your ancestors' fault, or, you know, there's not enough people, there's not enough space or resources in Canada for your people to come here, or, you know, like, we're past the point of those kinds of conversations. And I think that one of the gifts that intersectionality brings to our work in the academy, but also to faith communities and places where we're still having like really difficult, hard conversations, just grappling with this. And I think that it's in those conversations that we become aware of the needs of the other, right? Like, I was 100% behind plastic straw bans, and then, you know, there's a couple of ministers in the United Church, lay leaders and ordained ministers who live with cerebral palsy, and they're like, that is the only thing that works for me. I have tried compostable, I've tried paper, I've tried stainless steel, and like, physically, that's the thing that works for me. And I'm like, okay, so maybe an outright ban is like not the right thing. And, you know, there's all these places where you have to like really deeply think about like the true, I guess, like the end user result of our actions and our consumerism, and, you know, how much do we really need of anything? Yeah, I don't have a good answer, but they're good discussions to have, I think.
Right.
Reese, I see your question.
Reese, please. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for that. Like you, I also did my MDiv in the States. I think you did your MDiv, or maybe it was just the doctorate in the States. As I was thinking about this, and to give you some background, I grew up in a more fundamentalist type church setting where, you know, you're given the Bible and you're told to read the Bible. And one of the papers I wrote in my MDiv is, when do we really read Judges 19? Like, where some of those problematic texts, when do we actually read them in community? And when you were talking about how that Indigenous story and it's pedagogical and it's political and it's shared and it's told, it's held and it's shared at a specific time. And I'm wondering if that is something that would be, how do you share that with this Western mindset of, okay, you read it and you're good, and instead of like you're reading it in community, or you're being given the story, right? And especially with like the parables, and how maybe do we take that understanding of the story is the truth, and fiction isn't necessarily wrong. It can be truthful. It just doesn't have to be factual. But when are we given those stories? How do we read them in community? Do you have, maybe from that philosophical point or cultural worldview, can you share how we could maybe do that better?
Yeah, and I think that's where the confrontation of the justified truth claim is really important, right? Like, one of the purposes, or I guess one of the benefits of Indigenous concepts of history being pedagogical and ethical is that the story can change to suit what you're trying to teach, right? Whereas we would say like, well, you're not telling the story right, like that is inaccurate. And that's one of the reasons why I find the whole like historical Jesus project really funny. I'm like why? Like, why do you care? Like, really, why? Like, what is the purpose of studying the gospel to help you understand your next right thing that you should be doing in the world today? Like, I don't actually know that the historical Jesus project adds anything to the world. I also tend to like not just really read the Bible. It's a very United Church approach to things, I guess. I mean, I say that kind of glibly because I feel like anecdotally, the United Church of Canada, we tend to be like the biblically less literate denomination in Canada. But also for me, I think the Bible is dangerous because people like take one line and they say, you know, there is no Jew nor Greek, and that we feel like that's a really like awesome inclusive thing to say. But for me or for Nestor, like our cultural and racial difference being eradicated is not necessarily like a life-giving thing, right? It's part of an assimilationist project, the way that I understand it in certain contexts. And so, you know, I think the Bible is fine and good. I think that because of that tradition of like trying to justify a truth claim, it's like so much of biblical studies has been around, well, here's why I think this is like a justified truth claim about what this means or how it was written or what the original context was. And it sort of defeats the whole purpose of this idea of story as guiding right action. And for me, I guess that's just like a real cross-cultural thing where I mean, it's by the grace of God I passed any classes in Bible or biblical language. And you know, because my great grandmother said, if you're going to have a standard, you might as well have two. So I also have like my personal biblical passage that is like my own mission statement, which is 2 Timothy 4 verse 5, which is always remain sober, doing the work of an evangelist and carrying out your ministry fully. And that's sort of like how I try to live my life. But that's really the only phrase in the whole Bible that I know. So, but I think story can be a really instructive way to have conversations, and it can be a really you know, in the story I told about like coming alongside somebody and working with them as being the best way to learn in our culture. I feel like fiction and story is the way that we can do that in a way that doesn't come at like tackling a problem together, right? Like it's like, well, we're going to get in a fight about you know, divesting from fossil fuels, to pick something that's really popular in Alberta. And so right away you're in a like a positional like us versus them. This is my perspective. Your perspective is wrong. But if you start with a story and you say like, well, how does the story relate to your experience in the world? Then we can learn about each other in a way that is not around who's right and who's wrong. And I think the Bible can do that too. I think that's why people enjoy going to Bible study. I've never done it, but I keep thinking maybe one year I will, as like a Lenten practice or something. Like I'm actually going to like study the Bible this year, one day.
Thank you. Monique, would you like to take over in the chat questions? Thanks.
Yeah, for sure. So we have a question from Kelly here. First of all, she says, thank you so much for this talk. And she's curious, given your recognition of the broken system and broken promises of Western epistemology, what is your motivation for continuing to grapple with it through the lens of Christian theology and theodicy? Why do you think continuing to think about Christian theology is valuable?
So Kelly, are you asking me like, how can I still be Native and Christian and still stomach the church, given the church's complicity with all of this colonization and genocide? For anybody who's watching, she said in the most respectful way, yes. I mean, I think that's what my doctoral dissertation was about, really. And I also think that, you know, what my grandmother's white fragility was about, and like, well, you know, oh, the other really racist thing she said to me one day was like, I sure hope you remember that the Christian story is the Easter story and that there's hope at the end of it, because you're sure starting to sound like an angry Indian. And I was like, well, Grandma, I am an angry Indian. So there's that, like, real talk. But I mean, there is, so the late Sally McFaig was my first professor of theology, and the first words out of her mouth in my first lecture on my first day of my first semester of my MDiv was, theology matters. And what we think and say and do and believe about how we think about God and the world matters, and it has real consequences for us. And I think that the other thing she taught us, which I used as justification for never learning about the Bible, is that like the specific texts of the Bible are not really all that important. What's important is the through line of the Bible and the through line of those stories that inform our faith and those ideas about God, because what we think about how we define God and what God wants for us in the world informs our actions. And I think for me, that was like the hook that has kept me here. That and the fact that, and this is not a super common story, but in our people's story, the Heiltsuk people, we were intentionally and unintentionally infected with smallpox in the mid-19th century, and they estimate there was around 25,000 Heiltsuk people, and by like 1905 there was less than 400 of us left. And so my great-grandfather, and so like this is how short the timeline of colonization and genocide is, right? Like my great-grandfather was one of less than 400 of our people left, who, along with other hereditary chiefs, went and spoke to Thomas Crosby, who's like this figure of like Canadian missionary history in the Methodist Church, and said, we know that coming to Bella Bella, to Waiglesla, and living in your mission, we all have access to medicine that could help us survive this pandemic that is killing us, or this epidemic that is killing us. And we also know that coming to live in your mission has strings attached. So we want to come and spend some time with you and learn about your faith and your Bible, and we'll decide if we can live with that, or if we're going to take our chances and go back to our traditional villages, because we occupied about like 25,000 linear kilometers of coastline along all of these fjords and islands. And so they spent 3 weeks and did a Bible study that was like part in Heiltsuk, part in English, part in Chinook. And they went through the whole Christian story in the Bible, and the missionaries explained to them what they believed in. What they decided was that there was nothing in the Bible or their understanding of Christian faith that was inconsistent with our traditional ways of being in the world. And in fact, there was this idea of forgiveness that we didn't have. And they saw it as a way out of the perpetual cycles of war that we were engaged in for centuries between the Haida, Heiltsuk, the Coast Salish. And so they like converted to Methodism en masse. They went like home and got the rest of the people and brought them to Bella Bella, and became very fervent evangelical Methodists and then good United Church people. And I think that the evangelicalism of that, Victorian Methodism is also why people in our community are either Pentecostal or United Church, right? Like we either went with the evangelical side of Methodism or like the social gospel side of Methodism. So the fact that for me, Christianity is not only associated with residential school and Euro-Christian white supremacy and colonization, but also that our ancestors made, I wouldn't say it was completely like free will choice to do it. It was like the lesser of two evils, really, in surviving the smallpox epidemic, but that they made it an informed choice to become Christian, and that is part of who I am too. And I think that it's really easy to romanticize, even though we can't know it truly, like a pre-contact Indigenous culture. And the truth is that our cultures have always been evolving and always had like ways of growing and shaping and being influenced by the people that we came in contact with. And the church has been and continues to be incredibly abusive to people and to communities, but Christian faith for me still has some salvific and liberative promise. And I don't see atheism or even, there's no Indigenous spirituality or cultural practice that one excludes Christianity. And I 100% understand why some Indigenous people reject Christianity and everything Christian. But for me, I don't find it necessary. And for me, I feel it's a way to, like I said earlier in the paper, not just for translating traditional Indigenous worldviews into the academy, but also to be able to be a point of connection between that history and people who want to do better because they know better.
Okay. We have a question from Joy Palacios. Joy, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk and for also for sharing your stories and your history, how it connects you to theology and epistemology. I was thinking about how it can be helpful to think about Western philosophy or the Western tradition. And then sometimes it's also helpful. I'm getting an echo. I don't know if other people are as well.
It went away.
Oh, good. And then sometimes it's helpful to drill down because Western cultures also have differences among them, and the English philosophical tradition leads to some different conclusions than the French or the German philosophical tradition. And I was wondering whether there are times in your work where it's helpful to drill down further and start to think about the nuances between different Indigenous peoples in North America and their perspectives. Are there times where, and I'm asking out of ignorance, I don't know, I haven't had a chance to study these cultures, but are there times where they don't all have the same epistemology, where there might be differences among them, and where that can be interesting and fruitful when then thinking back to questions like theodicy or theology? I'm thinking about indigeneity as a block. I'm kind of wondering, like,
so
when to drill down, I guess.
Yeah, and you know, for the purposes of my doctoral work, which is like a lot of what I drew on for kind of summarize these epistemological differences for the lecture, Viola Cordova says, like, in you know, not trying to create like a pan-European worldview or like a pan-Indigenous worldview, but for the purposes of just highlighting difference, like French and English and German philosophical schools have more in common with each other, and like Indigenous, like North American Indigenous worldviews have more in common with each other to the point where you can compare them in sort of like this global way, to the point of like making some of these grand differences. But you know, I think on the one hand it's kind of hard to, because there's so few. There, like I said, there's like, you know, for me to study Indigenous epistemologies, I did a PhD in interdisciplinary studies, so I studied Christian mission and Indigenous epistemologies, neither of which are disciplines. And I kind of had to like go across all different academic disciplines and find, so I was like science, curriculum studies, education, psychology, philosophy, and theology were sort of like the big six areas where I looked at Indigenous scholars who were talking about epistemological issues. I think, you know, there's just like this really small body of work, and so it makes it hard to kind of drill down, because we're all kind of almost like finding safety in numbers, right? Like, but then there's, you know, you get into issues of like politics of representation and the fact that our communities were like, or our traditions were not, you know, like there's no right definition of anything, right? Because we don't have justified truth claims. And so it gets really hard within, I think, an academic setting to go there, because the academy is so focused on like scientific method, which is like really comes out of that Cartesian Enlightenment worldview, that like to codify anything in a paper or a talk like automatically moves away. It becomes then like rational, logical argument based on a justified truth claim, which is exactly what our worldviews resist. And so I don't know that the academy is like the right place to do that. I think that there's, I know that there's epistemological differences between different Indigenous nations, just because so much of epistemology is informed by language. Like British Columbia is one of the most linguistically diverse places in the world, and Guatemala being the next in the Americas. And really, I think in order for us to get to a place where we can really deeply discuss those things in the same way that different European traditions can discuss it within Euro-Western philosophy, we would have to have a lot more language reclamation and really truly have some fluent speakers who understood how our worldviews are represented through Indigenous language. But, you know, for example, we had slavery on the West Coast, and in our romanticized ideas of like pre-contact Indigenous people, it was like, oh, there's all these like peace-loving people, and, you know, like the arguments that there wasn't warfare before contact, and it was sort of like a divide and conquer thing. But, you know, we had wars and we had slaves, and I think we had a much better economic system that is more sustainable. But that's also, you know, like capitalism was dependent on slavery, so that's not necessarily better. I don't know if that answered your question, but.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Right. Okay. Now it is getting close to 5. I mean, but if anyone does, oh, Rachel. Hi, Rachel Schmidt. Rachel Schmidt has a question. Yes, please go ahead.
Oh, hi, Carmen. Thanks for this amazing talk. I really appreciate what you've been saying. I think one of the things I've taken away from it is that it's important for all of us. I speak of this as, you know, someone of European descent, a settler of European descent. And I recognize this in my own culture, my own pedagogy, my own discipline. I'm a literary person. To recognize that ethics and epistemology are not only taught through philosophy. And I appreciate hearing about how you in your culture do this, and wonder if maybe even for someone who is of European descent and, you know, very European in my culture, just listening to you talk about that is very helpful for me. I'm just going to say that. And maybe we as Europeans need to understand ourselves better and recapture some things about our own culture. So thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Oh, I think I see Marika Cassis, please.
I actually, just following on what Rachel just said, I actually have a very practical question. I wonder if you would be willing or able to recommend things that you found formative in terms of reading, because I think a lot of us are going away from your talk thinking hard thoughts. And I wonder if you have any recommendations.
Well, if you're interested in like the philosophy side of things, there's a book on, I think it's even called American Indian Philosophy. It's edited by Ann Waters. Viola Cordova is posthumously published. It's the only book of her work that was published, but her students and her partner published it after she died. It's called How It Is. That was particularly, like, I read it and I was like, oh, there's somebody else in the world that like cares about epistemology. That was probably the first one I read. Anything by Tink Tinker, but especially the articles that he's been writing since he retired from ILIF. American Indian Liberation, the Theology of Sovereignty is probably the most like dog-eared and like marked up book in my library. Thomas King's An Inconvenient Indian. He's just funny to read.
Great.
Yeah, and then I think like some of the non-Indigenous writers that I really found as like good partners in theology have been like John Caputo, specifically The Weakness of God and What Would Jesus Deconstruct? Manifold Witness by John, oh my God, I can see it, John Franke, you can see his face. He also comes to a place in terms of Christian mission and this idea of complementary rather than competitive truth claims. Yeah, I don't know. For
That's
liturgy,
good.
like Claudio Carvalho. If you ever have the chance to hear a lecture or worship service or sermon by Claudio Carvalho, who's at Union Theological Seminary, he's one of my favorite people on the planet, and just has these like incredibly, even his papers at AAR is like, you know, he's preaching, he's like full on preaching, like mic drop at the end and then walks away. And he'll like throw up his sermon papers and like walk away from the pulpit, like he's just, you know, I remember one of his talks at AAR and him saying, "Bless me, Father, for I have more than I need." You know, bless me, Father, for I have more than I need. And can I understand my sisters and brothers and what they need, and may I share some with them? It's like and then the stupidity of the market and the stupidity of the logic of the market and capitalist systems. And yeah, he's ethically and pedagogically, he's right up my alley.
That's great. And there's a couple of suggestions in the chat as well. So thank you. That's wonderful. Usually when I'm asked on the spot to recommend some books, I go blank. So that was very impressive.
Yeah. I'll probably keep thinking books like thinking, I'm like, oh, and I should have said this one and this one.
Are there any other questions? I think I just summarized by what Kelly said in response to what you said to her question. Thank you so much for your beautiful answer. It was a wonderful talk and a very rich discussion. And just want to thank you so much for coming to our department and for sharing your insights. It's been so wonderful. And I'm happy to say that the conversation continues, because tomorrow from 1 to 2:30 at the Calgary Public Library, virtually though, I'm happy to say that Reverend Dr. Lansdowne will be giving this year's Chair of Christian Thought Iowasa lecture on urban theology. And you can register for this if you haven't already done so through the Calgary Public Library website, or you can indeed go to our departmental website, and the registration information can be found there. The title of the talk, the longer title, which doesn't appear on the library website, but I can tell you, is Lessons from the Streets: The Liberative Wisdom of Brené Brown in Addressing Multiple Existential Threats. And I look very much forward to that tomorrow. Reverend Dr. Lansdowne, thank you so much.
There's going to be no philosophy in it. I feel like I over-prepared for this lecture because it's been a while since I actually gave a lecture in the academy, and I'm sorry for that. I feel like
don't apologize for your wonderful talk. I think the clap signs and heart signs speak for. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for attending today. Thank you so much.
Bye.